The Cursed Hour by Marlowe. Chapter 1. The Midnight Scream. The clock in the village square struck midnight, its chimes reverberating through the silent streets. Another night, another scream. It had been the same for years. Every night at exactly 12 o'clock, the residents of the small, isolated village heard the scream. It was a sharp, chilling sound, like someone was being torn apart from the inside. The kind of scream that made the hairs on your neck stand up and your heart race with an unexplainable terror. But no one knew where it came from. No one knew who or what was causing it. It was simply there, haunting the village like a shadow that could never be shaken. The villagers had grown used to it. At first, there had been whispers, fearful conversations in the dark corners of pubs, and nervous glances exchanged across market stalls. But over time, they had all come to accept it, as if the scream was a part of the village's nightly rhythm. It was just something that happened, and they learned to live with it. Except for Thomas. Thomas Hawk had never been one to ignore the strange. As a boy, he had been drawn to the unexplained, the eerie whispers that the others brushed aside. His childhood had been filled with ghost stories and tales of things that lurked in the dark. He had always been curious, always seeking answers. But now, at 32, that curiosity had grown into something more, a determination to uncover the truth. For years, Thomas had heard the scream, just like everyone else, but it gnawed at him. Every night, when the clock struck 12, he would sit up in bed, his ears straining to catch the sound, his heart pounding in anticipation. The scream was the only thing that seemed to unsettle him now, the only thing that didn't make sense. He had spoken to villagers, of course. He had asked questions, tried to piece together what everyone knew about the scream, but the answers were always the same. It's just the way things are around here. Nothing to worry about. It's been going on for as long as anyone can remember. But Thomas couldn't accept that. There had to be a reason, a cause, something that made sense. Tonight, he had decided, he would find out. He wasn't going to sit idly by and let this mystery remain unsolved. He would go to the source of the scream. He would track it down. As the clock in the square began to chime, signaling that midnight was approaching, Thomas stood at the window of his small cottage, looking out at the darkened streets. The air outside was heavy with fog, and the dim glow of the street lamps barely cut through the thick mist. It was the kind of night that felt wrong, too still, too quiet. The scream would come again. Thomas had spent the entire day preparing for this moment. He had gathered his coat, a flashlight, and a notebook. He had mapped out the village, pinpointing the places where the scream seemed to originate from. The woods on the outskirts, the old church, the abandoned mill by the river, all of these places had been mentioned in hushed conversations, rumors passed from one villager to another. He had no idea where to start, but tonight he would start somewhere. A glance at the clock. The hands moved steadily toward 12. Then it came. The scream. It was even louder than usual tonight. It pierced the air, a raw, guttural sound that seemed to shake the very earth beneath Thomas's feet. His heart skipped a beat as the familiar terror washed over him, but he pushed it down. He had made his decision. He couldn't turn back now. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside, the fog swallowing him whole. The air was thick with moisture, and the ground beneath his boots was soft and muddy. As he walked down the narrow, cobbled streets, he could feel the weight of the village pressing in on him, the walls of the old stone houses seeming to close in with every step. The village felt wrong tonight, as if something was watching him from the shadows. The scream echoed again, this time closer, louder. Thomas quickened his pace. He reached the village square and stopped, looking around. The clock tower loomed above him, its face glowing faintly in the fog. There was no one else in sight. It was as if the village had emptied out, as if they had all heard the scream and hidden away in their homes, unwilling to face whatever was causing it. But Thomas wasn't afraid, not yet. He followed the sound, each step taking him deeper into the heart of the village, toward the old mill by the river. It was an eerie place, abandoned for years, the windows boarded up, the wood of the building rotting and cracked. The mill had been a part of the village's history, but now it was just a place where rumors festered. The scream came again, louder than ever. Thomas hesitated for a moment. The mill was dark, silent, except for the rustling of the trees in the wind. But there was something else now, something he couldn't place. A faint glow, like a flickering light, was visible through the cracks in the old wooden walls. Without thinking, Thomas moved toward the mill, his footsteps careful but determined. As he reached the door, he stopped. The faint glow had grown brighter, and he could hear faint sounds from within, murmurs, whispers, and the distinct sound of something moving. He raised his hand to the door handle, but stopped just before touching it. A sudden chill ran down his spine, and his breath caught. Chapter 2. Into the Shadows. The door to the mill creaked under his hand, hesitant, as if protesting the intrusion. Thomas stood still, his breath heavy in the cold night air, the fog swirling around his feet. He could feel his pulse quickening, the anticipation mingling with an unsettling sense of dread. The scream still echoed faintly in the distance, but now it seemed almost like a memory, drowned out by the sinister whispers that emanated from within the mill. The glow through the cracks in the wooden walls seemed to pulse, drawing him in, like a moth to a flame. But unlike a moth, Thomas knew he couldn't turn back. The truth was just on the other side of that door, and he could feel it in his bones. With a deep breath, he turned the handle. The door groaned open, revealing the interior of the mill, bathed in dim, flickering light. The smell of mildew and old wood hit him immediately, sharp and pungent. His flashlight flickered in his hand as he stepped cautiously inside, the beam cutting through the darkness like a blade. The first thing he noticed was the dust, thick, choking dust that covered the floor, the beams, and everything in between. It was as if no one had set foot here in years. The walls were lined with rotting wood, and rusty machinery loomed like forgotten giants, their gears still and unmoving. But there was something unsettling about it all, something off that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand. Thomas pushed forward, the beam of his flashlight wavering across the room. The faint light he had seen before now made more sense. It came from a small, makeshift lantern placed on a workbench in the corner of the room. It cast eerie, dancing shadows on the walls, flickering like something alive. He swallowed hard and stepped closer. His boots crunched on the wooden floorboards, which groaned in protest with each movement. The whispers grew louder as he approached the lantern, and for the first time, he realized they weren't just whispers. They were words. Words he couldn't quite make out, but the tone of them sent a chill down his spine. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice louder than he intended. It echoed in the silence, swallowed by the vastness of the mill. There was no immediate answer. For a moment, the mill was still, the only sound the soft thrum of his heartbeat. And then, as if on cue, a shadow moved in the corner of his vision, just beyond the reach of the flashlight. Thomas spun around, the beam of light darting across the room, but there was nothing. Just the dark, decaying machinery. His breath hitched, his instinct screaming at him to leave, but his feet wouldn't obey. Something was wrong here. He could feel it in his gut. He took a step forward, drawn to the lantern, its faint glow almost hypnotic now. The whispers had stopped, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. But Thomas knew better than to trust silence. There was always something lurking beneath it. The workbench was cluttered with tools, rusted, worn, forgotten, but there was something else there, too. a stack of old papers, yellowed and crinkled with age. Without thinking, Thomas picked up the topmost sheet, his fingers brushing the brittle surface. The words on the page were written in a careful, almost religious hand. The harvest is coming. It cannot be stopped. We are the offering, and the hour draws near. A cold shiver ran down Thomas's spine as he stared at the words, his mind racing. The scream, the whispers, the ritual. Everything was starting to piece together in his mind, but the truth was more horrifying than anything he had imagined. He had come here seeking answers, but now he realized he had only uncovered the beginning of something far darker. He looked around the room, his flashlight scanning the walls. There were symbols carved into the wood, intricate and disturbing. They resembled ancient runes, twisted and unrecognizable, as if they had been etched by hands that had long since turned to dust. They seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as though they were alive, waiting for something. The lantern flickered again, and for a brief moment, Thomas could have sworn he saw something, someone, standing in the far corner of the room, just beyond the shadows. His heart skipped a beat. He turned the flashlight toward the figure, but it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. The door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang. Thomas froze. His heart pounded in his chest as he spun around, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was trapped. For a moment, there was no sound, no movement. Then, slowly, from the depths of the mill came a low, rumbling noise. The ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble, and a faint, unnatural glow filled the room, growing brighter with each passing second. And then, from the darkness, it came. The scream. It wasn't distant anymore. It was here. It was as if the very walls of the mill had become a mouth, and the scream was coming from within the building itself. Thomas staggered backward, his eyes wide in terror as the ground seemed to shift beneath him. The shadows grew longer, creeping along the walls like something alive. The scream intensified, filling the room until it was no longer a sound. It was a force, pressure pushing in on him from all sides. The lantern on the workbench flickered violently, casting a long, twisted shadow across the room. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the scream stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Thomas's breath came in shallow gasps as he looked around, his heart racing. The shadows had receded, but the feeling of dread had only grown stronger. The mill was no longer just a place. It had become something else, something ancient and hungry. He turned to the door, his mind racing for a way out. The latch was old, rusted, but it gave way with a screech. He threw the door open and ran out into the foggy night, not daring to look back. The mill loomed behind him, silent once more. But Thomas knew one thing for certain now. The scream wasn't just a noise. It was a warning. And whatever was coming, whatever had begun here in this forgotten village, was far from over. Chapter 3: The Hidden Truth. The fog seemed to have thickened overnight. It clung to everything, like an unseen presence, wrapping around Thomas as he made his way down the narrow path that led from the mill. His heart still raced in the wake of what he had witnessed, what he had barely survived. As he walked, the terror that had gripped him inside the mill slowly began to shift into a quiet determination. He had seen something, no, felt something, that no one else in the village seemed to understand. They had all dismissed the scream as superstition, a story whispered between drunkards in a local tavern. But it wasn't just a scream. It was a warning, a harbinger of something far worse. Thomas pulled his coat tighter around himself as he neared the village square. The soft glow of the street lamps barely pierced through the haze. The usual early morning calm had yet to settle into the town, but the silence felt suffocating. He could still hear that scream echoing in the back of his mind. His eyes darted around, seeking answers in every shadow. In the distance, the church bell tolled, its deep chimes signaling the hour. Midnight had passed, and the world had quieted down again. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just scratched the surface of something far darker than anyone could imagine. Something tied to the scream, to the mill, and to the old legends that haunted this village. Thomas knew one thing for sure. He couldn't go this alone. He needed help, but who could he trust? The villagers had grown distant over the years, their faces hollow with fear and exhaustion. No one spoke openly about the strange events that had plagued the town, and most were content to bury their heads in the sand, pretending that nothing was wrong. But Thomas wasn't that type of man. He was a detective. And if there was one thing he could do, it was uncover the truth, no matter how dark or terrifying it might be. He turned off the main road and approached the old tavern at the edge of the square. It was a small building, weathered and worn, with a crooked sign hanging above the door that read the Hollow Oak. It had been the center of the village's social life for decades, but in recent years it had grown quiet, its wooden floors creaking under the weight of years gone by. As Thomas entered, the air inside was thick with the smell of old wood, stale beer, and the faint scent of tobacco. The dim light from a few scattered lamps barely illuminated the interior, casting long shadows on the walls. A few people sat at the bar, muttering to one another in low voices, their faces drawn and weary. Behind the bar, the owner, a stout man named Edgar, wiped a glass with a rag. Edgar had seen everything, the highs, the lows, the joys, and the tragedies of this village. He was one of the few who had lived here long enough to remember when things had been different. Thomas walked up to the bar, nodding at the few faces he recognized. Edgar looked up, his tired eyes narrowing slightly. "Thomas," he said with a grunt, "you're up early." "I need to talk to you," Thomas replied, his voice low. He wasn't sure why, but he felt the need to speak to Edgar alone, in private. Edgar studied him for a moment before nodding toward the back room. He motioned for Thomas to follow, and the two of them moved away from the main bar, through a narrow hallway, into the dimly lit space where Edgar kept his personal items. The room was cluttered with old photographs, newspapers, and a collection of strange trinkets from bygone years. Edgar took a seat behind a cluttered desk and motioned for Thomas to sit across from him. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. "What's this about, Thomas?" Edgar asked, his voice gruff. "You don't look like you've had a good night." "I haven't," Thomas said, his tone steady but urgent. "I went to the mill." Edgar's eyes flickered with surprise, but quickly masked it with a forced calm. "The mill's been abandoned for years. There's nothing there but dust and memories." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "That's what I thought too. But I heard something, Edgar. Something I can't ignore. A scream. And it's not the first time." Edgar was silent for a moment, his gaze shifting to the side. His knuckles whitened around the glass he had been absent-mindedly holding. "You're talking about the cursed hour," he muttered, as if the words themselves carried a weight. "The scream everyone's heard, but no one talks about." "I know it's not just a story," Thomas pressed, his voice rising. "There's something happening here. Something terrible. And it's connected to the village's past. I need to know what it is, Edgar. What is going on?" Edgar sighed heavily and leaned back in his chair, staring at the floor as if searching for the right words. After a long pause, he spoke again, his voice barely of a whisper. "The village has always had its secrets, Thomas. The scream, it's just a part of something much bigger. The people who came before us, they made a deal, a pact. And every year at the cursed hour, the harvest must be completed. It's tied to the land, to the blood, and to the fear that pulses through this place. Thomas's mind reeled as Edgar's words settled over him. A pact? What kind of pact? Edgar's eyes flickered toward the window, and for a moment it seemed as if the shadows outside had shifted, stretching unnaturally long. The kind of pact that demands a sacrifice. A harvest, not of crops, but of lives. And when the scream is heard, the harvest has begun. And once it starts, it can't be stopped. Thomas felt a cold shiver run down his spine. And what happens to those who are chosen? Edgar's gaze hardened. They vanish. Every year, someone goes missing. Someone is taken by the harvest. But no one ever talks about it. No one ever asks questions. Because the moment they do, they become part of it. A wave of nausea hit Thomas as he processed what Edgar was saying. He had suspected something was wrong with the village, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. This scream was a warning, yes, but it was also an omen. The harvest was coming, and it was going to take more than just one victim this time. You have to stop it, Edgar said, his voice trembling. You're the only one who can, Thomas. The truth is hidden in the past, buried in the old records. The town's history holds the key to ending this. But you have to find it before it finds you. Thomas stood up, the weight of Edgar's words pressing down on him like a leaden cloak. He had no choice now. The truth was more terrible than he had ever feared, but he couldn't turn back. The village was already spiraling into darkness, and he was the only one who could stop it. I'll find the records, Thomas said, his voice grim. I'll stop the harvest. But I need your help, Edgar. I need to know where to look. Edgar nodded slowly, his face pale. The old church, he whispered. There's a hidden room beneath the altar. That's where the truth is buried. Without another word, Thomas turned and strode out of the tavern. He had no time to waste. The cursed hour was drawing near, and the harvest would soon begin again. Chapter 4. The Hidden Room. The air felt denser as Thomas approached the church. The fog had thickened, shrouding the town in an eerie silence. Each step he took echoed in the stillness, his heart thumping in his chest. Edgar's words from earlier weighed heavily on his mind, and he knew that the truth was hidden somewhere beneath the church's ancient stone floors. The old village church, with its crumbling spires and ivy-covered walls, had been a place of worship for centuries. It had stood through every season, every storm, and every whispered secret, but tonight it would reveal something far darker. As he neared the church, the grand oak doors loomed before him, heavy and foreboding. They creaked open with an unsettling groan when Thomas pushed against them, the sound reverberating through the empty space inside. The flickering light from a single candle near the altar cast long, wavering shadows, making the pews seem like dark sentinels waiting in the corners. The scent of aged wood and candle wax filled his nostrils as he stepped inside, his boots clicking on the stone floor. The church had always felt cold, but tonight it felt colder, as if the building itself had been waiting for him to arrive. The altar was illuminated faintly by the candlelight, its wood worn and cracked from centuries of use. Behind it, the stained glass windows cast fractured patterns of light across the floor, the images of saints and angels barely visible through the grime. But it was the altar that held his focus. Edgar had said that the truth was hidden beneath it. Thomas walked toward the altar, each step slower than the last, and as if the weight of what he was about to uncover pressed heavier with every inch closer he got. The air seemed to thicken around him, and the coldness intensified. He could feel the presence of something ancient, something that had been waiting for him to uncover it. The truth was buried here. It had been here for centuries, waiting to be unearthed. He reached the altar and ran his hands over the smooth surface of the stone. There was nothing unusual about it at first glance, just an old time-worn fixture. But Thomas knew better. Edgar had been clear. Beneath the altar there was a hidden room. The only question was how to open it. His fingers traced the edges of the stone, searching for any seam or crevice that might give way. Nothing. But then, just as he was about to step back in frustration, his hand brushed against something. A faint indentation in the stone, almost imperceptible, but there. Thomas pressed on it, and to his shock, the altar shifted with a low rumble. The stone slowly moved, revealing a dark passageway beneath it. He felt a rush of cold air hit his face as the hidden entrance creaked open, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed up from below. A chill ran down his spine. This was it, the room Edgar had spoken of. Without hesitation, Thomas descended the stone steps into the hidden chamber. The air grew colder with every step, and the darkness felt suffocating. He fumbled for a match and lit a small lantern he had brought along, the soft glow of the flame barely piercing the gloom. The room below the church was unlike anything Thomas had expected. It was small and cramped, but what struck him most was the walls, covered in strange symbols and drawings, smeared with what appeared to be old blood. The floor was littered with remnants of rituals long forgotten, candles, fragments of broken bones, and faded scrolls. The very atmosphere in this room reeked of dread, of something unspeakable that had taken place here in the past. As Thomas explored further, he spotted an old wooden chest in the far corner, partially hidden behind a crumbling stone pillar. His pulse quickened. Could this be what he was looking for? He approached the chest cautiously, the faint light from his lantern flickering against the shadows. The wood was aged and cracked, but it wasn't locked. He lifted the lid with a creak, and inside he found a stack of yellowed papers. He reached for them, his fingers trembling slightly as he pulled the top sheet free. The paper was covered in dense, intricate writing, something old, something foreign. Thomas's heart raced as he scanned the words. It was a diary, or perhaps a ledger, chronicling events that had happened long ago. The entry seemed to recount the lives of the village's early inhabitants, each one detailing the arrival of strangers, of rituals performed beneath the ground. But as his eyes fell upon the final pages, his breath caught. The last entry was dated the night of the first scream. The harvest begins once again. The pact we made with the darkness is upon us. The scream marks the beginning of the blood, and the land will take what it is owed. We will feed it, and it'll spare us for another year, but the blood will be spilled, and we are the ones who must spill it. Thomas's stomach turned. This was it. This was what had been hidden beneath the church for centuries. The truth about the curse that had plagued this village, the harvest that was made every year, and the lives it took in the dead of night. The scream was not a mere cry. It was a warning, a signal that the ritual had begun. His eyes darted over the rest of the pages. The words were becoming more frantic, more desperate with each entry. The final lines were almost incomprehensible, as if whoever had written them had lost their sanity. They are coming. The harvest demands its blood. We cannot stop it now. The darkness will come for us all, and the scream will be our last. There is no escaping the pact. Thomas closed the diary and felt the weight of the revelation settle on his shoulders. The harvest wasn't just a story. It wasn't some folklore to scare children at bedtime. It was real, and it was happening again. Suddenly, a noise echoed from the far side of the room. The faintest sound, a whispering, scratching sound that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. Thomas turned, his heart hammering in his chest. A shadow moved across the wall, dark and formless. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and his breath became visible in the cold air. The scream. It had already begun. Chapter 5: The Harvest Begins. The air in the hidden room grew even colder, pressing down on Thomas as if the very walls were closing in. His lantern flickered dangerously, casting wild shadows on the walls, making every corner seem to pulse with malevolent life. The whispering sounds continued, unnerving and persistent, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Every hair on Thomas's neck stood on end. He stood frozen, unsure of whether to advance or retreat. The shadow that had flitted across the wall now seemed to loom, its form indistinct yet unmistakably present, as if something or someone was watching him from within the darkness. The very atmosphere felt charged with impending danger, a palpable tension that made it hard to breathe. The whispering intensified, now mingling with a distant, eerie wail, faint but unmistakable. The scream. It was the same scream that had echoed throughout the village each night at midnight, the sound that had plagued the residents, leaving them haunted and sleepless. But this time it was closer. This time it felt as though it came from deep within the earth itself. Without thinking, Thomas stepped forward, his boots tapping quietly against the stone floor. He couldn't let this curse, this ritual, claim another life. He had to understand what was happening and put an end to it before it was too late. His eyes scanned the room, searching for the source of the sound. The diary he had found was heavy in his hands, the ancient paper now seeming more like a map. Its cryptic words were guiding him, pulling him forward. But then he froze. A figure emerged from the shadows in front of him. At first, Thomas thought it was a trick of the light, a distorted shape. But no, as the figure drew closer, he could see it clearly. It was a man pale as death, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. His clothes were tattered, drenched in something dark and sticky that resembled blood. Thomas stumbled back, his heart racing. He had never seen this man before, yet the look in his eyes, a look of desperation, of pain, struck a chord within him. The man reached out a trembling hand toward him, his voice raspy and broken. "Don't let it happen again," the man croaked, his words barely a whisper. "Stop the harvest before it claims us all." Before Thomas could respond, the man lurched forward, his eyes wide with terror. "It's here," he rasped. "The blood is coming. It's coming for you." The lantern in Thomas's hand flickered, casting one final burst of light before it went out completely. The room plunged into darkness. For a moment, Thomas stood frozen, his breath shallow in the pitch-black room. Then the scream came again, louder this time. It reverberated through the walls, vibrating in his bones, sinking deep into his skin. It was the scream of the cursed harvest. The man's warning echoed in Thomas's mind. "It's here. The blood is coming." Thomas gritted his teeth and tightened his grip on the diary. He had no choice but to press on. He could hear the scraping of nails against stone, unnatural, like something or someone scraping their way across the floor. The oppressive darkness closed in, and the air grew thick with a sense of something creeping just out of sight, waiting to pounce. His pulse quickened as he stumbled toward the only exit from the room. The stairway leading back to the church's main floor was just ahead. He could hear the muffled footsteps of something drawing nearer, the sensation of being followed gnawing at his mind. His instincts screamed at him to run, to escape, but he couldn't. Not now. Not after everything he had learned. He reached the base of the stairs, his breath ragged, and as he ascended, he could hear the shadows behind him, the scraping, the whispering, the movement of something that should not exist. He had uncovered the secret of the harvest, but it had only deepened the mystery. The door at the top of the stairs swung open, as if by some unseen force, the air in the church now thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. He blinked, disoriented, and when he stepped through the threshold, he found the church transformed. The pews were overturned, the altar defiled. The candles, which had once flickered faintly, now burned with a sickly, unnatural flame. And then he saw it. The figure stood before the altar, a tall, hooded silhouette. It was an embodiment of darkness itself, cloaked in shadows that seemed to pulse with an almost palpable hunger. The figure's head tilted upward, and Thomas could feel its gaze pierce him, though its face was hidden beneath the hood. "You are too late," a voice, deep and hollow, echoed from the figure's mouth. "The harvest begins now. The land demands its payment, and there is no escape." The room grew colder. Thomas could feel the chill seeping into his very bones. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, as if the air itself had thickened to hold him in place. "No!" Thomas shouted, but the words were swallowed by the oppressive silence that surrounded him. The air was suffocating, thick with something malevolent. The scream was no longer distant. It was right outside, deafening in its intensity. A series of flashes danced in his mind, images of faces twisted in agony, of blood staining the soil beneath the harvest. This wasn't just a ritual. It was an insatiable force, a curse that had bound this village in a cycle of death and fear. The figure raised its arm, and a low, inhuman growl filled the room. It was then that Thomas understood the harvest wasn't just an event. It was a living thing, a presence that fed on fear, on sacrifice. The scream wasn't just the beginning. It was the signal for the cursed cycle to claim another. The figure's voice cut through the thick air again, more insistent this time. "The pact is sealed. The blood will flow, and you are part of it." Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. The truth was clear now. There was no stopping it. The harvest would not be denied, and he, just like the villagers before him, would be consumed by it. The scream rose again, louder, unrelenting. As it pierced the night, Thomas understood that there would be no end to this nightmare. Not for him, not for anyone. The harvest had begun. Chapter 6: The Unveiling. The church was silent, the heavy air pressing down on Thomas as the figure before him seemed to loom, its presence as chilling as the grave. He could feel the cold seep deeper into his skin, the weight of impending doom making every breath harder to take. The scream outside echoed like a living thing, sharp and desperate, as if it was calling for him, waiting for his decision. The figure stood motionless, the cloak shrouding its form, making it appear as though it was part of the very darkness itself. Thomas's heart raced, his instincts telling him to flee, but he couldn't. There was no escaping the truth now. The harvest was real, and it was tied to this cursed village. "You," the figure whispered, his voice dark and rasping like a broken record, "are the final piece." Thomas took a shaky step back, his mind racing. What do I mean? The final piece of what? His pulse hammered in his ears as the reality of the situation hit him like a cold wave. The figure wasn't just some stranger. It was something much older, much darker. "You don't understand," Thomas said, his voice trembling but steady. This isn't happening. It can't be." The figure's head tilted slightly, the shadows beneath its hood shifting like something alive. For a moment, Thomas thought he saw eyes, glowing faintly, piercing through the darkness. But no, it was just his imagination, or perhaps the faint candlelight flickering around the room, casting impossible shapes in the corners of his vision. "You cannot stop it," the figure continued, its voice louder now, more insistent. "It has been written. It has always been." Thomas's mind spun. Written? Always been? The diary. He had to think of the diary. With trembling hands, he pulled the weathered journal from his coat pocket, the pages now crinkled and fragile from the repeated handling. He had read through it endlessly, but something was missing, something he hadn't understood until now. As he opened the book to the final pages, he found the words that had eluded him for so long. The writing, faded and distorted, described a ritual, an ancient ceremony tied to the very land the village stood on. The harvest, the blood, each phrase bled into the next, forming a grim prophecy of sacrifice. There was no stopping it. The harvest has always needed a keeper, the figure said, almost like it was reading Thomas's thoughts. The one who stands between the land and the hunger. You were always meant to be that keeper. The coldness in the room deepened, seeping into Thomas's bones, making it harder to focus. His legs were beginning to feel numb, his senses overwhelmed by the oppressive weight of the church, the shadows, and the unrelenting scream echoing from outside. But I'm not the one, Thomas protested, his voice rising in panic. I didn't know about any of this. I just came here because of the scream. I couldn't stop it. The figure raised a hand, and the church seemed to groan in response, the wood of the pews creaking as if the very building was alive. You are too late. It has begun. You always were the final piece of the puzzle. You thought it was just a curse, but it was never that simple. Thomas's breath quickened. The pieces were coming together, but they were not making sense. The figure moved slightly, its cloak flowing like smoke, and a low growl rumbled from deep within the earth beneath the church. The very ground seemed to tremble, as if it was awakening. You are part of the harvest now, the figure declared. The blood will flow and the land will feast. The figure's words cut into Thomas's thoughts like a knife. The blood, the scream. It was happening again, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His chest tightened as the realization washed over him. The villagers had all been tied to this. Each death, each disappearance, a necessary piece of the harvest. His gaze shifted to the altar, where strange symbols had been etched into the stone, their dark energy pulsing with every beat of his heart. These were not just marks, they were keys. Keys to unlocking the true nature of the curse. He had to stop it. But how? Suddenly, the scream outside intensified, more shrill than before, as though it was being pulled from the earth itself. The church walls seemed to shudder as the air thickened with the stench of decay. The land was hungry. The harvest was coming, and there would be no escaping its hunger. Thomas forced himself to move, his legs like lead as he approached the altar. He had seen the symbols etched into the stone before, on the walls of the hidden room beneath the church. These marks were tied to the harvest ritual. If he could understand them, perhaps he could find a way to stop it. His fingers traced the symbols cautiously, each one tingling with a cold, unnatural energy. They were complex, ancient, and they held the key to the harvest. But what was the final step? What was missing? The figure behind him spoke again, its voice like ice scraping against stone. You cannot outrun fate. The land demands the harvest, and now it calls for you. Before Thomas could respond, a deafening crash echoed through the church as the doors slammed shut, trapping him inside. The walls groaned, the shadows in the room stretching and twisting like living things. Thomas's heart pounded. There was no more time for hesitation. With trembling hands, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the knife he had taken from the village elder's home. The cold steel felt like a foreign object in his hands, but it was the only weapon he had. If he was to survive, he would have to use it to break the ritual. He raised the knife and pressed it against the altar's surface, just above one of the strange symbols. The knife seemed to hum in his grip, vibrating with an unnatural force as if it, too, was part of the land's curse. And then, with a final, desperate push, he drove the blade into the stone. The church erupted in a violent roar as the shadows collapsed in on themselves. The ground trembled, and the air turned to ice. The scream reached its deafening peak, reverberating through every inch of the building. For a split second, everything was still. And then, with a flash of blinding light, everything went dark. Chapter 7, Into the Abyss. The silence in the church was deafening. Thomas could hear nothing. No scream, no groaning walls, no ominous whispering. Only the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat as he stood frozen in the center of the altar, the blade still buried in the stone. His breath came in shallow gasps, the chill of the room clinging to his skin like a damp shroud. Had he done it? Had he stopped it? The question echoed in his mind, but the unsettling emptiness around him offered no answers. It felt as though time itself had stopped, the seconds stretching long enough to drown in them. The shadows that had once danced along the walls now seemed to be still. Everything was frozen, as if the entire world had held its breath. And then it came, a low, guttural rumble that began deep beneath the earth, an ancient, thrilling vibration that rattled the very foundation of the church. Thomas's legs buckled, his knees threatening to give way, but he gritted his teeth and stayed upright. He couldn't afford to break down now. The air seemed to twist and ripple around him, the light from the candles flickering wildly as if they, too, were struggling to survive in the suffocating dark. His head spun with confusion, and for a moment, he wondered if the ritual had worked or if it had simply taken him deeper into whatever nightmare had consumed this town. Then the ground began to shake. The vibrations intensified, knocking the altar stone from its place and sending the pews crashing to the floor with an ear-splitting crack. The whole church seemed to come alive, groaning and creaking, as if it were a living, breathing entity. The air thickened with a sense of foreboding, and the cold turned from an uncomfortable chill into something far more sinister. It was the kind of cold that seeped into the bones, the kind of cold that felt like the touch of death itself. Thomas staggered backward, barely keeping his footing. His eyes darted to the altar where the symbols were now glowing faintly, the markings etched into the stone pulsating with an unnatural light. There was no denying it now. The harvest was upon them, and he had only made it worse. Why? He muttered to himself, his voice a rasp. What did I do? As if answering his question, the sound of the scream, an unearthly, agonizing cry, ripped through the church. The walls seemed to bend and shudder with the force of it, and the ground cracked open, revealing a yawning abyss beneath Thomas's feet. He stepped back instinctively, but the pull of the abyss was undeniable. It was like something was reaching up from the depths, something hungry. The earth groaned as though it had a mind of its own, and for the briefest of moments, Thomas could have sworn he saw movement in the blackness below. Something was down there, waiting. A voice, low and malicious, echoed from the depths of the earth, resonating in his very soul. It was speaking directly to him. "You're too late, Thomas." The words were like daggers, each syllable punctuated with a terrifying, otherworldly resonance that vibrated through his chest. He felt a cold sweat break out on his skin as the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. "You've unleashed what you cannot control." Thomas stumbled back again, his hands reaching out for something, anything, to steady himself. His mind raced, but it couldn't catch up with the overwhelming weight of the revelation. The town had always been cursed. The scream, the deaths, the harvest. It was all connected to this thing beneath the earth. He could see now, clearly, the true face of what he had stumbled into. The harvest was not merely a ritual. It was a sentient force, a being older than the town, older than the land itself. And it had been waiting for him, for the right moment to feed. It was coming, and he had awakened it. A shadow moved in the corner of his vision, a figure materializing from the darkness. It was the same cloaked figure he had seen in the old journals and the warnings, standing there with a presence that seemed to devour the very light. The figure's face remained hidden beneath the hood, but Thomas could feel its eyes boring into him, knowing him, waiting for him to understand the truth. The figure stepped forward, the air around it thickening like smoke. The land demands its due, it said, its voice a mere whisper, but one that reverberated through every fiber of his being. The blood has been spilled, and now it seeks the harvest. Thomas felt a surge of panic claw at his chest, suffocating him. He needed to act, needed to stop this. He couldn't let this town, these people, fall to this horror. "What do you want from me?" he yelled, his voice breaking. "I can't stop it. I don't know how." The figure tilted its head slightly, a gesture that sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. "You already have." Thomas's heart stopped. What did that mean? Before he could react, the ground beneath him began to split open wider, the abyss yawning wider, the earth groaning in pain. The figure stepped back, its form flickering, as if it were losing its shape in the rising darkness. "You cannot save them," it whispered, "but you may be able to save yourself." The ground cracked once more, and Thomas felt the pull of the abyss grow stronger. There was no escaping it now. The harvest was inevitable. The scream was its harbinger, and it was time for the land to feast. With one last glance at the figure, Thomas did the only thing he could. He jumped. Chapter 8: The Descent. The world around Thomas fragmented as he plummeted into the darkness. His limbs flailed, the cold air whipping past him in a blur. He didn't know how long he was falling, seconds, minutes. Time had lost all meaning. All that mattered was the overwhelming, inescapable pull of the abyss below. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the fall stopped. Thomas's body slammed into the ground, his breath knocked from his chest. He gasped for air, the weight of the fall leaving him momentarily disoriented. He had expected the sensation of being swallowed whole, but instead he lay in the dark, unnaturally still and quiet. A low hum vibrated through the air, a pulsing sound that resonated deep within him. It was the sound of something alive, something ancient, and something hungry. Slowly, Thomas pushed himself up, his hands scraping against the cold stone beneath him. His fingers trembled as he made contact with the rough surface. The air was thick, oppressive, and it smelled of decay, like the earth had long ago given up on being anything other than a vessel for death. As his eyes adjusted to the dim, flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere, he realized where he had landed. It wasn't a cave, nor a subterranean chamber, but something far worse, a forgotten catacomb, an ancient tomb that had been abandoned for centuries. The walls were adorned with faded symbols, runes he couldn't recognize, their meaning lost to time. The floor was cracked, uneven, as though the ground had shifted and settled in some unnatural way. Every inch of the place felt like it was breathing with a life of its own, the air too thick to inhale fully. And then he heard it again, the scream. It was distant at first, echoing from somewhere deeper within the tomb, but it was unmistakable. It was the same scream that had haunted the village every night at midnight, the same agonized wail that had driven him to investigate in the first place. But now it sounded closer, more urgent, as though it had found him, hunting him. Thomas scrambled to his feet, the cold seeping into his bones as he moved toward the source of the noise. Each step felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, but he pushed forward, driven by a need to understand, to find out what he had unleashed. The ground began to slope downward, and he followed the path, the scream growing louder with each step. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end, the hairs of his scalp prickling as if something were watching him, waiting for him to come closer. As he rounded a corner, the tomb opened up into a massive cavern. The walls of the cavern were lined with ancient, weathered stone pillars, their surfaces covered in strange carvings that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. The floor was littered with bones, human bones, animal bones, some long forgotten, others more recent. The air here was thick with the stench of death, of decay, and something else, something far darker, far more sinister. In the center of the cavern was a large stone altar, its surface stained with what looked like blood, though much of it had dried and crusted over. Around the altar, standing in a circle, were figures cloaked in dark robes, their faces hidden in the shadows of their hoods. The figures were chanting, their voices low and guttural, their words unfamiliar. They moved in unison, like marionettes controlled by an unseen hand. The scream rose again, louder this time, more desperate. It came from the altar. Thomas's eyes darted to the center of the cavern, where he saw the source of the scream. A figure, small, fragile, was bound to the altar. A child. The child's face was obscured by shadows, but Thomas could see enough to know that the child was struggling, trying to break free from the ropes that held them down. The child's eyes were wide with terror, tears streaming down their face as they screamed again, their voice breaking with fear. The figures in the circle continued their chant, their rhythm unbroken, oblivious to the child's plight. Thomas's heart raced. This wasn't just about a scream. This wasn't just about a haunting. This was a ritual, a sacrifice. He had walked straight into the heart of it. Before he could act, a figure in the circle, the one closest to the altar, turned toward him, its head lifting from the chant. The figure's face was hidden beneath the hood, but Thomas could feel its gaze upon him, cold and unblinking. The chanting stopped. A silence fell over the cavern, suffocating and heavy. The figure stepped forward, its voice smooth and cold. "You should not have come here, Thomas." Thomas froze, his breath caught in his throat. How did it know his name? The figure continued, its voice eerily calm. "You have disturbed the harvest. The curse cannot be undone. It has already begun." The child on the altar screamed again, a raw, guttural cry of pure terror. Thomas's heart twisted. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let this innocent child become part of whatever ritual was unfolding here. Without thinking, he lunged toward the altar. The figure's arms shot out, gripping Thomas by the throat with an unnatural strength. The air around them seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides as the figure lifted him off the ground. "You don't understand," the figure hissed. "You are too late. The harvest has already begun. The land calls for its due, and you cannot stop it." Thomas struggled, gasping for air, his hands clawing at the figure's wrist. The grip tightened, and the world around him began to blur. His vision faded, and the chanting started again, this time louder, more forceful. Then, just as he thought he was about to lose consciousness, something strange happened. The child on the altar stopped screaming. The chanting ceased. The cavern trembled. Thomas's eyes snapped open. He felt a shift in the air, something snapping into place. The figure's grip loosened, and he dropped to the floor, gasping for breath. His hands immediately went to his chest, but the darkness in the cavern seemed to grow even more oppressive, swallowing the light. The child's eyes opened, and they were no longer filled with fear. They were filled with something far worse. Chapter 9. The Harvest Awaits. Thomas staggered backward, his breath ragged as he struggled to regain his bearings. The cavern, once eerily silent, now buzzed with an unnatural energy. The air around him thickened, pressing against his chest as though the very earth itself was trying to consume him. The child on the altar slowly lifted its head. Its eyes, once full of terror, were now dark, voids, black and endless. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest as the child stared at him, its face expressionless. In an instant, everything around him shifted. The chanting began anew, more frantic this time. The figures in their robes resumed their circle, their bodies swaying rhythmically, as though they were caught in some trance. The words they spoke had a weight to them now, a finality that made the ground beneath Thomas's feet tremble. The child's mouth opened wide, but no scream came. Instead, an oppressive wave of cold washed over him, and with it came a sensation far worse than any scream, a whisper that clawed at his mind, sharp and insidious. It's too late. Thomas's stomach churned. He wanted to run. He wanted to leave, but he couldn't move. His legs refused to obey, rooted in place by some unseen force, as though the ground had seized him, pulling him into its depths. You're the last one. The words curled through his thoughts like smoke, and the air grew thicker with each passing second. He could feel it now, the weight of the curse, the hunger, the harvest that had been growing in the shadows, waiting for this moment to arrive. The scream, the ritual, the sacrifice. Everything had been leading to this. The child's eyes narrowed. It tilted its head slowly, as if assessing him. Then the child opened its mouth again, and this time it spoke, not with the voice of innocence, but with a deep, unsettling resonance that seemed to reverberate in the very walls of the cavern. You should not have come, the child said, its voice layered with 1,000 other voices, each one darker than the last. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This was no child. Not anymore. The creature, whatever it was, had taken its form, using it to lure him into the very heart of this ritual. The child's body was nothing but a vessel, a tool in the harvest that had been set in motion long before his arrival. He felt the ground beneath him shift again, as though something deep within the earth was waking. The stone beneath his feet groaned, and the cavern seemed to grow larger, stretching impossibly wide. The pillars that lined the walls began to crack, ancient symbols glowing faintly with an unnatural light. The walls closed in, the ceiling lowering slowly, as though the cavern itself was descending. The child on the altar lifted its hand, fingers long and skeletal, reaching for him with unnatural grace. With every movement, a wave of pressure pushed against him, forcing him back. This is the end, Thomas, the child said. The harvest is upon you. The figure who had first spoken to Thomas, the one cloaked in shadow, stepped forward. Its face, still hidden in the depths of its hood, did not need to be seen for Thomas to feel its gaze burning into him. The figure lifted its hand, and the chanting reached a crescendo, vibrating through Thomas's very bones. He understood now. This wasn't just a sacrifice. This wasn't just some ritual to appease a dark god or demon. This was the culmination of years, decades of bloodshed, of feeding the land with terror, of harvesting fear. The scream at midnight, the strange deaths that had plagued the village, the whispers that had driven people mad, it had all been part of a larger design. The land, the cursed hour, the ritual, they were all tied together. And now the harvest had come for him. You were always meant to be part of it, the figure whispered. Your fear, your presence here, it has sealed your fate. Thomas tried to move, tried to run, but his body betrayed him. His limbs shook, his vision blurred as the pull of the cavern grew stronger. The child's gaze never left him, its eyes dark and hollow, like the abyss itself. The ground trembled again, and then the altar cracked. A deep, resounding snap echoed through the cavern as if the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. The child's fingers twitched, and the runes etched into the stone altar began to glow, pulsing with an eerie, unholy light. No! Thomas screamed, finally able to speak, though his voice felt like it was coming from far away. This can't be happening. The figure closest to him stepped forward, its face still hidden, but its presence now a suffocating force. It raised a hand, fingers curling, as though it were about to reach into the very fabric of Thomas's soul. Nothing can stop the harvest, the figure said, its voice echoing through the cavern, rich with finality. The land demands it. And now, so do you. Suddenly the child screamed. It was a shriek like no other, a sound so full of anguish, of pain, and of suffering that Thomas's knees buckled beneath him. The cavern shook violently, the very stones reverberating with the intensity of the sound. For a brief moment, everything around him went white, and then silence. The light faded. The chanting stopped. The air grew still. Thomas struggled to open his eyes. When he did, he realized that everything had changed. The cavern, once filled with looming shadows and oppressive force, was now empty. The altar was cracked, the symbols gone, and the child, whatever it had been, was nowhere to be seen. Only the silence remained. In the remnants of the curse, Chapter 10, The Final Scream. The silence that enveloped the cavern was unnatural. It pressed in on Thomas from every side, thick and suffocating. His heartbeat thundered in his chest, each pulse sending waves of terror through his body. His mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. He had been so close to understanding, to stopping whatever dark force had bound the village to this ancient curse. But now, he wasn't sure if anything could undo the horror that had already been set in motion. With trembling hands, Thomas pushed himself to his feet. His legs felt weak beneath him, as though they no longer belonged to him. His eyes scanned the cavern, the remnants of the altar casting eerie shadows against the walls. The pulsating light was gone. The child was gone. The figures who had once circled the altar, murmuring in their strange, ancient language, were now nothing more than shadows in the distance, fading into the darkness. But something lingered in the air, a sense of wrongness that had not yet lifted. He tried to breathe, to calm his racing mind, but it was useless. The weight of dread hung heavy in the cavern's stillness, filling his lungs with ice-cold fear. Thomas forced himself to move, each step slow and deliberate, as though the very ground beneath him was trying to trap him once again. As he made his way toward the edge of the cavern, his eyes fell upon the stone walls, where the strange markings had once glowed with ominous light. Now they were dull, as if they had lost their power, but he knew better. The power had not gone, it had simply shifted. The cavern's oppressive air seemed to be shifting too, thickening once more, coiling like a serpent, ready to strike. Thomas felt his stomach churn. His hand instinctively went to his side, where the knife he had brought with him hung loosely in its sheath. He wasn't sure why he still carried it. He wasn't sure if it could help him. But something told him he would need it. The echo of the child's scream still haunted his ears. It had felt so real, so powerful, like the very sound had been carved into his bones. And now, in the silence that followed, he could still hear it, just beneath the surface of the stillness, a faint whisper. The harvest is not done. The words sent a shiver down his spine. Who are you? He demanded, his voice shaking. What are you? For a moment, there was no answer, just the oppressive silence pressing in from all sides. Then a low laugh reverberated through the walls, a sound so cold and ancient it made Thomas's blood run cold. Do you still think it's over? The voice whispered, coming from all directions. The harvest was never meant to be stopped. It was only delayed. Thomas spun around, his eyes darting through the darkened cavern, but there was no one to be seen. Your arrival here, the voice continued, was no coincidence. You were always part of the plan, just like the others before you. The ground beneath him trembled, and the walls began to shift once more, the symbols returning to their former glow. The cavern, it seemed, was alive, alive with the ancient power that had been waiting, festering in the dark for generations. Thomas backed away slowly, his mind struggling to keep up with the unfolding reality. No, he whispered, a sense of finality creeping into his thoughts. No more. The laughter echoed again, louder this time, as though it were coming from the very stones themselves. You cannot fight what is already inside you, Thomas. The harvest is coming, and you are the final piece. And then it clicked. The final horrific truth. The village. The screams at midnight. The ritual. Everything. It wasn't just a curse on the land. It wasn't just some ancient evil preying on the villagers. The curse had always been about fear, feeding on it, growing stronger with each passing year, each sacrifice. But the final piece, the true horror, was that Thomas himself had been the final ingredient, the key to unleashing the harvest in full. It had all been leading to this moment, his arrival, his investigation, his pursuit of the truth. He had been drawn here unknowingly to fulfill the curse. He tried to run. He had to run. He couldn't let it happen, but his body refused to obey. The darkness had already claimed him, and the fear that had taken root deep inside him was now part of the very land itself. The child's voice returned, soft but full of a terrible weight. Now it is time for the harvest. The walls closed in around him, and the ground split open. From the cracks in the earth, tendrils of darkness rose, curling around his legs, pulling him toward the heart of the cavern. He struggled, his hands clawing at the air, but there was no escaping it now. The curse had been fulfilled. The scream came again. This time it wasn't the child's voice. It was Thomas's own. But it was too late. The harvest had begun, and the village would never be the same again.